Now that we've talked about syntax, let's talk about style. Remember our metaphor. Syntax is like the grammar of Python, and it will cause issues if the grammar rules are not followed. Style, following that same metaphor, would be like the writing style. In other words, the personality of our code. And it will not cause errors, but it does affect readability and standardization. So it's important that we follow also the guidelines for writing Python in order to write good code. PEP 8 is the official style guide for Python. PEP 8, remember that. And they have a website which overviews the style guide, and I have pulled that up over here. There's a lot to it. I encourage you at some point in your Python journey to read this at least once. I would not encourage you to read this now, but it talks about things like naming conventions, or when to use commas, white space, tabs or spaces, etc. All sorts of things to follow the appropriate style of Python and standardization. So one thing that really helps with learning PEP 8 and the style that should be followed for Python is using an IDE and a development environment like PyCharm, which we'll get into later in the course, because it highlights your code to help you follow PEP 8. So that's one advantage of using an IDE. And their guide, this is a guide, not rules, but it's accepted practice to follow. I'm going to share a few of the major highlights, in my opinion, of PEP 8 that are worth remembering, but I want you to don't worry about remembering all these right now, but come back to this later for reference. And with repetition, it will stick. So first of all, we talked about spaces with Python syntax, and indentation, rather. Well, PEP 8 recommends spaces, not tabs, for that indentation. They recommend 4 spaces where indentation is needed. One reason for that is that in different code editors or text editors, if you use a tab, it may not represent the same number of spaces as a different text editor. So if it's copied and pasted or opened by another programmer, it may look different. And we can make sure that our text editors and IDEs like PyCharm use 4 spaces every time we hit tab, so that we don't have to hit 4 keystrokes of the space to get the appropriate indentation. We can just hit tab, but in reality, it's spaces. So that's something we'll get to. Also, PEP 8 recommends 79 characters per line maximum. Again, in PyCharm, it shows you a line for the cutoff where 79 characters is, and it just helps. So IDEs really help with following PEP 8. Comment your code, that's important. PEP 8 really suggests that. There's some suggestions around blank lines and how they separate logical points of code. So instead of having just every single line filled with writing, it's good to have blank lines in between where needed. And imports at the top of the file, we'll get to that later. Quotes, we can use single or double quotes, but be consistent. So we see here we have a single quote around hello, this string, or a double quote around hello. They both work. They won't throw syntax errors. And you can use both, and I've seen both. Just be consistent with whichever one you choose. So let's go over here as an example. Print hello. That prints hello. Now if we use double quotes instead of single quotes, It also prints hello. It does the exact same thing. So not a syntax issue. It's just style. And pick one and stick with it, and you'll learn what you prefer over time. Also, when we're using multi-line comments, let's not use single quotes like this. So we wouldn't use 3 single quotes. We'd use 3 double quotes for multi-line comments. And doc strings, which we'll get to, also suggest double quotes instead of single quotes. Don't worry too much about that now. Again, as you go through the course, come back to this slide, come back to this section and review this, and it will solidify it for you. White space is good to use for clarity to separate operators and operands. For example, 5 space plus space 3 instead of 5 plus 3. But avoid white space in between, like between the parentheses and the 3, or between a bracket and a letter, a character. And avoid trailing white space at the end of lines. Also, 1 space after a comma is recommended. This is a space character here instead of no spaces. So keep that in mind. Space after the hashtag in a comment in a single line. And naming conventions use snake case for function and variable names. Snake case is where, when we're naming a variable, we separate words within the variable with an underscore. If we have a variable with multiple words, like my name, we separate it with an underscore as opposed to my name. Again, they both work, but snake case, this one with the underscore, is preferred and more appropriate style. And we'll get into some Pascal case for class names and uppercase for constants later on in the course. Don't use single character name variable names like a letter, except for very short blocks, like loops or things like that. And lastly, aim for clarity over brevity. As you're writing code, just think, make it simple, make it clear, and that will usually lead you down the right path. So those are some notes around Python style.